Good afternoon. I'm pleased to welcome all of you at this panel session on global anti-crisis policies as well as local anti-crisis policies during the pandemic. We have an outstanding session today in terms of the level of our speakers. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Kristalina Georgieva, Managing Director of the IMF. Good afternoon. Joining us is also Agustin Carstens, General Manager of the Bank for International Settlements. And we also have Lesetja Kiango, Governor of South African Reserve Bank, joining us online. Here at the studio, we have Andrei Kosting, President and Chairman of the Board of VTB Bank. And the host of our today's event is Madam Nabiullina, Governor of the Bank of Russia. During today's session, we are going to discuss anti-crisis measures because the year before became unprecedented because of the pandemic in terms of the measures that were taken by different governments and central banks. There's been a great variety of measures. Some were conventional, others unconventional, such as loose monetary policy, buyback of assets. A lot of budget allocations have been funneled into the economy. Some regulation with regard to the banking sector has been amended. So there's been a great variety of different measures, different mechanisms resorted to, and that is what has made this crisis unique. And another notable thing is that almost all countries across the world have resorted to these measures almost simultaneously. I think it would be too premature to draw any final conclusions because the pandemic is ongoing and the crisis is still there, even though we are slowly sort of recovering of it. But anyway, the comparison of different experience is very important. And my first question goes to Kristalina Georgieva. From the point of view of the IMF, you have a chance to look at different policies in different countries. So my question to you, from the point of view of monetary and fiscal authorities, what measures out of these varieties have proven to be most effective during this particular crisis? Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be with you.
Let me switch to English. It is truly a crisis like no other. And fortunately, we responded to this crisis appropriately in terms of content of the measures taken and the scale and speed with which they have been applied. In terms of content, it was very quickly recognized that when we put the economy in standstill and we ask producers not to produce, consumers not to consume, there has to be a bottom placed under the feet of businesses and households by providing massive fiscal and monetary policy support. And that was done in a coordinated manner. The many meetings of G20, G7, IMFC paid off. Central bankers, and Augustin will talk more about that, central bankers and finance ministers were quick to synchronize action. In terms of scale, we got in advanced economies the equivalent of somewhere around 27-28% of GDP in fiscal measures and in policy accommodation, in monetary policy accommodation measures. In emerging markets, around 7%, in low-income countries, around 2%. So what was done in countries with more fiscal space did have positive spillover impact across the world. In terms of composition of the measures taken, it is very impressive to see how central banks leaned forward with more aggressive forward guidance with applying all the instruments at their disposal from interest rate cuts to asset purchasing, including venturing in riskier assets. And what is very impressive is that there has been very quick establishment of swap lines that secured dollar liquidity and helped us to avoid a dramatic fallout for emerging markets. I still remember in March seeing how money flows out of emerging markets in huge amounts and worrying that this is going to lead to a catastrophic impact, only to be reversed on the basis of these policy measures. And there is another unique feature of the response to this crisis, that epidemiologists played a role in defining economic policy with projections around the evolution of the virus. And then, of course, our scientists, by coming up with vaccines very quickly, helped us to define a package of economic policy that is appropriate. Now, I want to make 2 points. Some of these measures that have been applied would need to gradually be withdrawn. And we know this is hard. So policymakers have to concentrate on defining a pathway to bring back some of the asset purchases in a way that is not harmful for the recovery. But some may be viable to be institutionalized for the future. For example, swap lines and the role they play to use the strength of the collective to protect individual countries. And my second point is to recognize the enormity of what has been done in terms of positive impact. We calculated at the fund that this decisiveness and coordinated action prevented the recession, which was really bad, about 33% shrinkage, 2.9 shrinkage of the world economy, to turn into depression. In other words, the world would have been 3 times worse off. We would have lost another 6% of growth if we did not deploy this synchronized, on scale and well-coordinated action. We also saw something that we probably will talk later about, the unfinished business from the previous financial, from the global financial crisis, from the previous big crisis. At that time, we fixed the banking system, more or less. That pays off. But the non-banking financial institutions were left to blossom without appropriate supervision. And we saw in March last year the risk that brings. So my main message here is that we need to internalize lessons from this crisis and do what we did last time around. Build a more vibrant financial system to withstand crisis to come. Finish the unfinished business, draw lessons that make the world more effective and more integrated, more coordinated for the future.
Thank you. Next, I would like to give the floor to Ryszard Ganyago, but before that, I would like to congratulate South African Reserve Bank on its centenary. I believe it is a remarkable anniversary. 100 years ago, the bank was established, and it was a milestone of South Africa's independence. Right now, South Africa plays a huge role in the world economy. And given that, I would like to ask you, as the head of one of the leading reserve banks, from your point of view as a head of a monetary authority, what measures of supporting the economy have proven to be most effective, both in terms of addressing the issues stemming from the current crisis and also, as Kristalina has said, from the point of view of creating a foundation to avoid future crises once they arrive.
Thank you very much, and good, Kristalina, to see you, albeit virtually again, and Agustin and Elvira. Thank you very much for the invitations. I think that when we talk of these measures, I'd like to first identify the global measures that were taken. I think that both the fund, the FSB, BIS moved with speed to do whatever they had to do within their power to provide the support. And I think that for the first time in a way, global coordination seemed to be working. There are important lessons to learn from there. Turning to the domestic measures that we had to take, firstly were the measures that had to be taken by the government. The containment measures were one thing, but I think what was important was to support the economies. And from South Africa's side, we came into this crisis with very constrained fiscal space, and we had to do something, which then meant that the fiscal matrix deteriorated further. And with the global lockdowns, it also meant that access to international capital was limited, and that is why the IMF and the World Bank coming in, and the other MDBs coming in and saying that you could access the following resources with speed. I think that became important. The space that we had was really the space within the realm of central banks. Monetary policy measures, we were able to act with speed, cut the policy rates to provide support. And to the extent that markets became dysfunctional, we extended facilities to market participants for the markets to continue at work, including an intervention in the bond market through the bond purchase program. And we were very clear that we were not doing quantitative easing because we were not at the zero lower bound. And our view was that we had to do this thing because market participants were not showing each other prices, and because of that, we were thus, as the central bank, had to step in because our own monetary policy operations work on a collateral system. And if pricing is not working in the financial markets, it is impossible to price the value of the collateral. And if we didn't step in, the very essence of the execution of monetary policy was going to not work. The third area had to do with the regulatory relief measures that had been provided, providing both capital and liquidity relief to the financial sector, so that they could provide support. What has worked, what has not worked? It's a difficult one to say what has worked, what has not worked. My colleague and friend Chief McCallum had this to say. You go to a doctor and the doctor says you are very sick. But do you know what? No single medicine can cure you. We are going to give you a cocktail of treatments. We'll give you some tonic, we'll give you some this tablet and this capsule and this tablet. And in the end, when you get better, you can't tell which one of them actually worked because they all had to work in unison. So it is difficult to say what has worked and what has not worked. But with that in mind, what was clear for us was that the fact that we had the monetary policy space, the speed with which we were able to adjust the policy rate, we could see the reaction of the key variables that normally react to changes in monetary policy. On the regulatory relief measures, there was not much of an offtake. The banks didn't dip into their capital. They didn't dip into their liquidity buffers. What was their preferred means of support? Their preferred means of support was the regulatory relief, where they could actually treat restructured loans differently. And as such, 10% of the outstanding retail, corporate and retail exposures were restructured. It was a good 600 billion rands. It was a significant amount, and that would have translated to about $3 billion for the economy of our size. That is significant. But the fact that the banks didn't dip into the capital buffers and the liquidity buffers does not mean these were not working. At least the banks knew, as they were providing this corporate restructuring, that they have got an opportunity, should things go wrong, to dip into the capital and liquidity buffers. What lessons have we learned? Very quickly, make hay whilst the sun shines. I think that the regulatory reform measures that had been taken, led by the Basel Committee, in particular in the banking sector, meant that the core of the financial system was very resilient when it was hit by this crisis. Secondly, I talked about policy coordination, both on the global basis, but also domestically, that both fiscal, regulatory, and monetary measures needed to act in unison. And thirdly, the balance sheet policies of the central banks, that they needed, this could not be utilized just across. It depended on country circumstances. And lastly, time is of the essence. You have got to act with speed and with scale, and rather, as time goes on, fine-tune the policy rather than waiting for a perfect opportunity to implement policy. So that would be my take, and let me leave it there and hand back over to you.
Yes, спасибо большое. И на самом деле хотел бы
Thank you. I would like to draw a comparison in the approaches of different banks. So my next question goes to Madam Nabiullina, because the Bank of Russia did not follow in the footsteps of other banks. The key rate was decreased afterwards, and you didn't buy out any assets. Right now, from today's perspective, do you believe that opting for this path was the right choice? From the outset, I would like to welcome Kristalina and Lesetia and Agustin. I would like to thank you for taking part in our today's session. I would like to say that any country, when such measures are adopted, the country specifics have to be taken into account too, and the situation in Russia was specific, but on the whole, I have to point out that we have adopted the same measures as many other countries. We have eased our monetary policy. The government has provided quite a lot of fiscal and budgetary incentives, and as Kristalina has aptly said, emerging economies have not that big of a fiscal margin, so we have also introduced some regulatory relief measures. But I agree with Lesetia. The measures have all been taken as a cocktail, sort of different kinds of treatments. But if I had to identify the most efficient measures, then I would point out the first one. First, we had a sharp decline in the second quarter when the economy was all but paralyzed and when the income plummeted. And the second stage, that is the economic recovery, when restrictions were gradually lifted. At the first stage, I believe what was most important were the measures adopted by the government with a view to providing targeted support for the income of people who were hit hardest, the households with children, for some businesses. For businesses, concessional lending was of great import, especially for SMEs, and afterwards those borrowings were simply written off if they managed to retain their employees. As far as the central bank's measures are concerned, of great help has been the restructuring of commercial credits, because many people simply lost their livelihoods and they couldn't pay back their debts. So restructuring these credits was of huge importance. And there is another measure that is probably country-specific. The thing is, there was a paralysis of economic activity at the global market, and it has brought about a collapse of oil prices, and there has been huge volatility in the currency market. And that is when we adopted a new, novel approach to currency interventions. We hedged against oil prices falling down below the $25 threshold per barrel, and the market was reassured by us. The intervention that we made, it stood at around 20 billion or so, but it helped stabilize the situation. At the second stage, when the economy was recovering, we understood that that is when the lower key rate would bring about positive consequences, and we decreased our key rate. We didn't think there was any need to buy out any assets. And of course, the government budget has provided targeted support too. You know, sometimes Russia is criticized for only providing targeted support, whereas I believe that this was the right thing to do, because the budget was funneling support to those specific people who lost their livelihoods. It helped support their standard of life. At the same time, it didn't create any overblown savings when even people with high income received such resources, and it didn't translate into higher financial assets. You know, some say that there are mortgage bubbles in some countries and accelerated inflation, whereas we don't have that in Russia. So I agree with Kristalina that the global coordination of efforts has been very important too, and this has helped launch a rapid economic recovery, which has also been a contribution to Russia's economic recovery. Our next question goes to Agustin, and it's about the consequence of such large-scale interventions and this cocktail of different measures. And it's very hard to understand which of the pills or those treatments have worked or not. But you know, when there are too many pills, there can be an overdose. You can go too far. You can overdo it. Don't you think it has been too much? Don't you think that we have created sort of a time bomb through these large-scale interventions, waiting to undermine future growth at some point?
Thank you very much for the question. Thank you very much to Elvira for this very kind invitation to participate in this panel with my good friends Kristalina and Lesetja, and also the banker that is represented here. Well, I would say that I would start from the point of view that the crisis that we faced last year doesn't really have a parallel in our modern history. I mean, it was a global crisis, a crisis where, in this case, a virus brought the world economy to a stop. To a large extent, it was a recession that was man-made. We put the economies on a sort of a suspended animation to generate the health conditions to contain the virulence of the virus up to the point of when vaccination and treatments would be available. So the idea was to bridge the situation from a real crisis situation to one in which it would be more livable and we could have better conditions for economic life. Now, once you basically induce a sudden stop in economic activity in a very sharp way, in a very contundent way, not only in individual countries, but in the whole world, it really, I mean, there is no option for policymakers to use decisively all the instruments at their hands. And I can say that policymakers responded in an absolute determined way, in an opportune way. We have learned from other crises that what you need to do is to use overwhelming force, and that's what has happened. And I think that so far so good. I think if you had asked me just a year ago if we were going to be in a situation where we are today, I would say, well, it's a relatively low probability. But so far, the response has been adequate. Of course, the vaccination has been very, very important. But the key point here is that we're still not fully out of the woods. We still need to make make huge progress in terms of vaccination, and here I fully support the very lucid policy recommendations of coordination that the IMF has done in terms to invest resources to accelerate vaccination and to reach a broader coverage or full coverage in the world. I mean, at the end of the day, I think that's what we should aspire for. So the points that have been made by the IMF are really of the essence. At this stage, so first I fully subscribe overwhelming force, doing everything you can. Of course, there are differences in terms of policy space. For natural reasons, advanced economies have far more space than emerging markets, and them even more than developing countries, as Kristalina mentioned in her initial remarks. At the same time, different authorities will have to monitor very, very carefully how far they can continue providing this accommodation. Certainly, I think right now it would be premature to start removing accommodation, but at the same time, there is no two ways about it. These accommodations have some limits, and therefore it would be good at least to have some plan for the future. I certainly don't think that we're at the point where we can say that excessive policy response was there. Again, I think that we still have ways to go. But as time passes, yes, some plans to normalize policy stance would be important, and I think these were mentioned by my colleagues that spoke previously. It will be very important to coordinate the exit. It's very unusual to see an overwhelming policy response with both monetary and fiscal authority at the same time. Something that we need to do as we move into the future is to engineer the normalization also in a coordinated fashion. We don't want to create cliff effects. We don't want to abort the recovery. At the same time, we don't want to create new problems. So it is a policy challenge, but we have time. We have good conditions now to think what will come next. The immediate thing is to continue with the progress of consolidating the recovery, and at some point after that would be to start thinking of an orderly exit. And at this stage, I would not be very concerned of overreaction. Thank you.
Спасибо большое. И следующий вопрос хотел.
Thank you very much, and I would like to direct my next question to Mr. Kosten. In terms of the way the banking sector was passing through this crisis, that was very much of a difference from what it used to be, because the banks became not part of the problem, rather part of the solution. In your sense, how did that happen? Because of the previous crisis, the regulation changed where the banks originally appeared in a better form, or it was specifically the change in the attitude on the part of the monetary authorities and the governments in different countries, which during the crisis helped the banks to become one of the locomotives which to push the economy out of it. Good afternoon. Thank you very much. I'm very grateful to the Central Bank leadership for inviting me to speak at such a reputable panel. I think in my status as the veteran of the Russian banking sector, because it's been for 25 years that I has been in charge of one of the biggest Russian financial institutions, and I can compare all of the crises starting from 1998 with the current one. And I do say that everything that you've just mentioned applies because, first of all, the Russian banking sector approached this crisis in a good shape, and a lot should be said in favor of the Russian Central Bank and its person in charge, because over the past years, the Russian Central Bank has been steadfastly working on improving the Russian banking sector. A lot has been done. Not only the fact that the number of banks in this country has gone down almost 2.5 times over the past 8 years, but also the fact that very strongly the capitalization of the banking sector has been improved, and all has switched to the third Basel requirements and many other measures for supervision. Solidity were initiated, which strengthened the Russian banking sector, and I'm sure that IMF had the chance to appreciate it on more than one occasion in its reviews, and I believe that everybody can see this. And so it is true that the banking sector turned out to be a very solid one, a very reliable one, and it could cope with much more difficult tasks than in the past. That was the first reason. The second reason, without doubt, a very quick and well-coordinated action on the part of the government and the central bank. And one should also mention that the Russian government, in the beginning of the crisis, its main outbreak, when the economy went into lockdown, which lasted just for 2 months, just 2 to 3 months, and one should really pay tribute to the new cabinet that it was quick enough to work out, together with the central bank, the set of measures that Elvira referred to. It was indeed a very much specific, very much down to the point, and focused upon the small and medium businesses, upon households. And one should also mention that apart from the government support, the banks on their own pursued a huge kind of an effort to offer loan holidays, and most of the loans specifically have been granted following the kind of recipes and the kind of terms that the banks originally proposed to their clients. And different banks organize the models in different ways, because the most dangerous thing for the bank is when interests are not being paid. So the banks try to avoid falling into such a difficulty. They offered delays and postponements, and so in a lot of ways, such restructuring ran in parallel with the government incentives, and it took shape upon the kind of ideas that the banks themselves amassed. So these were large-scale restructuring efforts, and one should say that quite quickly both the business and the households went back to the original repayment schedule. And generally speaking, the banking sector in this country during the hottest pandemic period in 2020 really didn't lose much of a profit compared to 2018, 2019. I would say that the profit level almost remained at the same level, as well as the pace of growth was more than 16% in the banking sector. We didn't notice any crisis decline, specifically in the development of the banking institutions, although the domestic gross domestic product shrunk by about 3%. The third very important reason is that this crisis was a special one, and maybe it remains a special one because the pandemic didn't leave, but the root of this crisis was not in the global economy or in the Russian economy, and not in the financial sector, as opposed to the very same subprime. I mean, the economy when the pandemic broke out was in a very good state, and it was quite healthy. And so the crisis happened because of the lockdown, because in an administrative way the borders were closed, the society, the communities were separated, and because of that the economic problems ensued as well as the financial problems erupted. But as soon as the lockdowns started being eased, the economy very quickly started recovering. And so already this year we can see that we're planning the very same kind of a recoil to the good positions like it was last year. I mean, in terms of the economic damage in a longer term time, we are not observing. And so it seems to me that the solution to it lies not in the economic area, but in the healthcare one, because we again are being confronted by the new pandemic wave. And whenever we are saying how long we're going to go for yet another set of measures, I believe that in the first place we should ask the medics, because they're supposed to give us some sort of a feasible answer in terms of how long that is going to last. And so we should basically be in a new lockdown because of the new viruses coming, and that is already beyond the assessment done by the economists or the analysts, because we're fully dependent from the healthcare factors, from the virusologists and the way the healthcare situation evolves. And I would say that the response by the monetary authorities and the governments in many ways will depend upon it, and that creates a lot of unpredictabilities. But today, generally speaking, our plans, and we expect that this year overall, if there aren't any substantive changes, we will pass successfully, and we are expecting to post record profit by the banking sector. And so in this sense, recalling 4 previous crises in my memory, this one is the easiest, but we're not yet out of this process, and we don't know what's in store for us. So it is important to take into account whenever we talk about the results of the crisis, but quite possibly it is not yet over. Oh yes, thank you very much. We don't have too much time left, so I would really like to very briefly get some answers which is directly related to what just Mr. Kostin mentioned. But what do you think about the current situation? I mean, that the worst is behind us. I mean, and from recovering from the crisis, we are sort of switching into the normal kind of policy making. All the policy is being changed right now, but it attains an unusual, not a normal kind of policy, which will be helping us to get out of the crisis. So I suggest that the Crystallinis will be the first ones to follow the same kind of rota.
We are in a very unusual space in terms of economic policy, because vaccine policy this year, possibly next year, is economic policy, and it may be even more important than monetary and fiscal policy in terms of driving an exit from this crisis. And this is why from the IMF, we are prioritizing global response, aiming to vaccinate 40% of the world's population by the end of this year, 60% by mid next year. Why these percentages? Because this is when we see a rebound in the economy in countries that have done it. And we are arguing that a $50 billion investment, this is what we put the price tag this action would cost, will be the best we make in our lifetimes, because if we accelerate the exit from the crisis, the world economy is likely to generate $9 trillion in additional output between now and 2025. So that is, to my mind, this is where we have to zero in on cooperation to get that done. And let me say, one thing of what worries me, what I lose sleep. In March, it was, are we going to see a collapse? Now it is this very dangerous divergence we see with countries, mostly advanced economies, some emerging markets, coming out of this crisis, growing quite rapidly, and the rest of the world falling behind. Why is this very dangerous for everybody? One, we have two-track pandemic, and that means we retain a breeding ground for mutations to ricochet in the rest of the world. But secondly, because if we see accelerated growth, let's take the United States, for example, that leads to accelerated exit from this accommodative monetary policy, interest rates up, possibly the dollar up, while the rest of the emerging markets, or big part of the emerging markets in developing world, are not exiting, then for countries with a high level of dollar-denominated debt, this can be a hold back with a major force, putting a risk the global recovery, not only the recovery in these countries. So I would argue very strongly for continuing with international cooperation. I want to praise Lesetche. He didn't say it, but he was the chair of IMFC during the depth of this crisis. And the example we set of working together, we have to continue to follow. We now are going to issue special drawing rights, the largest in the history of the IMF new allocation. Lesetche was there when we started work on it. That kind of using the strength of the collective to help those falling behind is a must if we are to recover faster for the benefit of everyone.
Thank you very much, Nasiti. Again, as I mentioned, the kind of important role that you played. So, in your mind, where are we right now? And what kind of measures need to be taken as soon as possible?
Well, we are still in the middle of the pandemic. What has been vaccinated had been people in the advanced economies. The emerging economies are, people are still not vaccinated in the main. And my worry is that unless we achieve global community immunity, you are going to have new variants emerging. And as we have seen, even in the countries where vaccination has taken place, these new variants rear their head there. And so it just struck me that we were faced with a global pandemic, and yet when it came to vaccines, the responses were very much domestic, instead of saying that we have got a global problem here. Secondly, is that Kristalina had had me make this point, and I didn't want to make it today, but because she is prompting me, I will have to make it. That getting into the during the global financial crisis, we all complained that the IMF was not well resourced to face that we decided to go temporary. And my plea throughout this crisis was, wait, are you going to wait for another crisis before you realize that the IMF needed permanent resources? It looks like finally the message resonated that we actually need an IMF that is well resourced. If you are going to be doing global coordination, you need well-resourced institutions that are positioned to do global coordination, to be at the center of that. And from a regulatory perspective, I think that both the BIS and the FSB did an excellent job much earlier on, taking stock, giving guidance about what regulatory buffers could be released and so forth. And that when we exit, it's going to be important that that coordination takes place, because if we exit in a non-coordinated manner, we might actually introduce risks to the system. And then lastly is that the exit from these extraordinary measures that we have taken. These have been wartime measures, but the war is not about over. The virus is still very much here with us, and that we cannot even say it will be out in 12 months or in or 15 months or whatever. We have got to be state dependent. We have got to see where we are with the virus, where is the global economy, so that the exit could actually take place in a more meaningful manner. And I know these things are easier said than done, because we have got a global economy, but we do not have a global government. But do you know what? We are part of the same planet, and we better act in tandem to get this thing going.
Thank you very much. And Elvira, what do you think? Well, I should say that we touched upon an extremely important topic, and we should all be aware that in as far as this pandemic crisis is concerned related to healthcare, we must not approach it as an economic cyclical crisis where we're used that there is a decline and there is a recovery and there is a new decline coming instead. A lot here will depend upon the way the epidemic situation evolves because we're currently living through its worsening, and we see that both the economics and our decisions by the central bank in many ways will be defined by the way it all goes on. And so the epidemiological situation will certainly depend upon the vaccination and its pace, not only upon the availability of vaccines, but also about the public awareness of the need to be vaccinated and the good that it will do. But speaking about the current day, we see that the Russian economy has almost recovered, but there was quite a quick recoil from it. It was an unusual crisis. When the restrictions were lifted, the demand very quickly rebounded, and so during that phase, to a certain extent, we have been caught up by the negative consequences of those very necessary decisions which were made last year. I mean, the accommodative monetary policy as well as the soft fiscal policy. In many countries, inflation is growing, and we must understand that there is a risk of these consequences continuing to remain alongside the risks related to the epidemic situation remaining. And that creates a new set of terms and conditions that we would need to account for. Another important aspect, a lot has been said here about the good benefit in the international cooperation. It is true that we have passed through the global economic crisis, and we learned to act in unison with respect to the global economic crisis. A lot is being done as part of the G20, but currently this is the global pandemic crisis, which calls for very close cooperation in terms of the financial and economic measures, bearing in mind and accounting for the financial policies in various other jurisdictions, as well as the global healthcare, the pace of vaccination, it's the availability of vaccine. And Kristalin was absolutely right when she said that there might be quite a difference in between different countries, and it will all impact all of us effectively. Thank you. Augustine, a similar question to you. Do you see a greater danger that the anti-crisis measures are going to be, suspended too soon or too slow?
No, as I mentioned, I think that by and large they will be calibrated appropriately. So far, the conduction of policy has been very, very, very accurate. I just would add a comment to what has been said. I already commented on the speed of the adjustment and the exit. I think that we tend to focus too much on fiscal and monetary policy for restarting accelerated growth on a sustainable basis. As we all have mentioned already, fiscal and monetary policy, so far the response has been exemplary, but we all recognize that in the medium term they have limits. What we need is to start engineering today higher growth. And for that, I think that we should not forget the importance of structural reforms. This is also very important because the slowdown has also accelerated many other changes in the economies, and that will could generate some issues in terms of growth. I mean, for example, we are not consuming in the same way as we used to consume in the past. Now the dependence on e-commerce, for example, is bigger. We don't know if we are going to travel in the same way as before. We don't know how the patterns of tourism will change into the future. We don't know how are we going to work in the future. Are we going to work more from home, from offices? How would this affect? I mean, all of this will affect dramatically the economy. And we have to start thinking about these issues. How are we going to prepare our economies for this new reality? And this is something that fiscal and monetary and regulatory policy cannot do. And in addition, even though, and as I already mentioned in my previous intervention, I 100% subscribe the effort that Kristalina is leading in terms of vaccination. We should not forget also to move forward faster in treatment. It is very likely that we will have to learn to live with this virus. And if we just manage to reduce dramatically the rate of fatality, or we can bring back to work people that get affected, the impact on the whole economy and on society in general will be far less. We rightly so concentrated in vaccination. Major successes has been there. But I think also, and I think there is a lot of potential, and there is also some showings out there that treatments could be speed up, can be generalized. And I think we should also move in that direction. Thank you so much.
Спасибо, Андрей Леонидович.
Thanks very much, Mr. Question. And what do you think in terms of the banking sector? Well, not to reiterate myself, I would like just to express one concern. I mean, the extension of the accommodative monetary policy, in my mind, may have certain unpredictable consequences. Just look at what is going on. Absolutely, the money which doesn't cost anything today, negative rates on euros, very low rates on US dollars, dramatic price growth for commodities, dramatic price growth in the stock market. Tesla, its capitalization is in excess of 1,000 annual company profit, or 1,000%. If we include all of the digital companies, their capitalization hundreds of times is above their annual profits, and even more. Households are leaving the banks with their deposits in Russia just within some year. The number of investors into the stock market grew threefold, and we expect that it will continue growing within the next 2 years. People start investing into much riskier instruments. They take away the resource base in terms of their deposits from the banks and go out into the market with unpredicted consequences, trying to earn more. Money loses sense for investors because it not only earns more money, but you still have to pay for this money to stay intact. So I believe that at a certain point in time, there must be an adjustment in this policy. But Kristalina was quite correct in saying that negative consequences may be felt already by the emerging market, including the Russian one. But I believe certain evolutionary steps must be undertaken despite the fact that we continue to live in the pandemic. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you. Thank you greatly. And I would like to thank all of our speakers for the kind of insights we were able to hear about what happened and what might still happen, and that we're still waiting for interesting times to unfold. Great many thanks to all.